Coming up, fresh revelations surfaced this week about Prince Andrew and his ties to the alleged Chinese spy Yang Tengbo, just the latest scandal surrounding our king's younger sibling. This news followed fast on the heels of reports revealing the jaw-dropping costs of King Charles' coronation and the extent of his avoidance of inheritance and other taxes that mere mortals such as you and I have to pay. I'm naturally inclined to be a Republican, not in the American sense of being a swivel-eyed Trumpist who believes that Jewish space lasers cause Californian wildfires. What I mean is, I don't like the idea that in Britain we're not a republic, that we're not born equal, that some of us are superior to others just by dint of whose vagina we emerge from. But it's more than just the offensive principle behind the monarchy. It's also that given the rising costs of keeping this archaic institution afloat, surely it's time to ask, why are we still funding it from public money? Stay tuned. We're now in the 21st century, yet 99.999999% of us are literally second-class, I would say citizens, but of course we're not, are we? We're subjects of His Majesty the King. To me, that feels almost childish, and I think it's about time we grew up as a nation. Royalty depends on popularity though, and thanks to a massively biased pro-monarchy media here in the UK, King Prince Charles, as I like to call him, has a net favourability rating not dissimilar to his mum's at plus 34%. The royalists argue that the king is a symbol of national unity, above the political fray, untouched by the grubbiness of party politics. But the truth is that King Prince Charles has a history of interference in ministerial decisions going back to at least the Blair government. Anyone remember the infamous Black Spider memos, so called because of Charles's terrible handwriting? He sought to influence the government of the day on issues ranging from badger sets and the provision of quack herbal medicines on the NHS, right through to our military presence in Iraq. His mother, the almost beatified Elizabeth II, also acted in a similar fashion, using her soft power with government to lobby to get certain laws changed. Most worryingly, intervening to prevent public disclosure of her private wealth. There are also reports that she investigated the possibility of dismissing Prime Minister Boris Johnson in 2019 when he illegally instructed her to prorogue Parliament to avoid debate on the hastily drafted and ill-thought-out Brexit bill. Even more concerning was that Elizabeth's influence meant that the Race Relations Act of 1976 did not initially apply to her or the royal household. In fact, her family and her staff enjoyed significant exemptions from legislation against racism for many years after 1976. So, for those arguing that a benign head of state with no real power is a perfect solution, I'd make two counter-arguments. First, that the monarch does have undefinable soft power, and this has been used behind the scenes unconstitutionally and with no public visibility of what government policies are being influenced. That's profoundly undemocratic. And secondly, I'd argue that we actually do need a head of state with explicit and defined powers to hold the government of the day to account. Boris Johnson's illegal prorogation of Parliament or Tony Blair's illegal war in Iraq are both classic examples of why this should be so. A lack of serious checks on government is dangerous, and although I accept that the House of Lords manages to get the government to moderate its mistakes from time to time, a second chamber stuffed with, at least for now, hereditary peers, Anglican bishops and political donors and cronies is hardly a perfect solution. There are arguments in favour of the monarchy. Some seem to have merit at first glance, but others are laughable, such as the cries of pro-monarchists who suddenly develop an overwhelming interest in the tourism industry. The monarchy brings in more money from tourism than they cost the taxpayer, they claim. Well, there's zero evidence to show that tourists wouldn't come to Britain if we didn't have a monarchy. They come for the history, the culture, the landmarks and the pomp and ceremony, all of which could exist without a constitutional royal family. Take the Palace of Versailles in France, where I visited last summer. Indeed, it's one of the most visited tourist attractions in Europe, pulling in millions of tourists each year. And there hasn't been a French royal family since 1848. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle and the Tower of London could still draw in tourists without the need for a constitutional monarchy. Other arguments often include the claim that the monarchy provides stability. Stability in this context means an unchanging, unfair system. Traditions that uphold inequality and lack of accountability shouldn't be preserved just for tradition's sake. Ultimately, the monarchy represents something far bigger than tourism or tradition. It represents an outdated and undemocratic principle that some people are born to rule, while others are born to be ruled. It's a relic of a bygone era, clinging desperately to relevance. On paper, they're a symbol of national unity and tradition, but in reality, they're a financial burden on a nation grappling with record taxation levels. Public money is being funneled into maintaining palatial homes and an absurd number of staff, while ordinary families are skipping meals and struggling to heat their homes. And don't let monarchists fool you with talk of income from the Crown estate profits. Those are state assets, not Windsor piggy banks. Then there's the coronation. King Prince Charles' little parade earlier this year, not constitutionally required, but insisted upon by His gloriously tetchy Majesty, costing taxpayers a whopping £72 million, and that's just the official figure, mind you. Real estimates suggest the total cost might hit £250 million, £250 million, once you factor in security, transport and local council expenses. And despite the massive amount of public money spent on proceedings, surveys showed that 91% of the British population struggled to contain their apathy about the coronation of its new unelected head of state. And let's look at the Duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall. These estates are massive revenue generators, pulling in millions each year from us, royal subjects. The Ministry of Justice is paying the Duchy of Cornwall, that's the bland and unremarkable Prince William, £37.5 million a year to lease Dartmoor Prison, which currently holds 0 prisoners due to high levels of radon gas on the prison estate. Meanwhile, King Prince Charles' Duchy of Lancaster charges the NHS £11.4 million to rent a warehouse for its ambulances. Yes, our NHS, currently at financial breaking point. If you're sitting on vast wealth and claiming to love your subjects, the only acceptable rent should be 0. It's a scandal. And talking of scandal, let's return to the sweat-free Prince Andrew. Already disgraced over his ties to Jeffrey Epstein's child sex ring, Andrew's name is now linked to Yang Tengbo, the man at the centre of the Chinese spy scandal. This is the same Andrew whose mother settled his sexual assault case for millions of pounds. What other public figure would be allowed such impunity? Yet here he is, shielded by the crown. I hear that the only sanction on him for the latest indiscretions is that King Prince Charles has asked him to lie low for 4 weeks. But it's not all about the cost and the scandals. The monarchy is fundamentally at odds with democratic principles. How can we claim to be a modern democracy while maintaining an unelected head of state? The Windsors inherited their positions by accident of birth. That's not democracy, and certainly not meritocracy. It's feudalism with a facelift. Comparable heads of state, like for example Ireland's president, cost a fraction of what we pay for our monarchy. And you know what? Ireland's doing just fine without a monarch. So what's the solution? It's time to reform and ultimately abolish the monarchy. Start by scrapping the sovereign grant from the taxpaying public to the royal family and start absorbing all those royal assets into a national estate owned by the nation. Cap the royal budget to cover just constitutional duties only. Force the royals to pay inheritance and income taxes like the rest of us have to. And let's have a full public inquiry into all of the royal finances. Transparency and accountability should be the bare minimum in a democracy. And those are just the first steps. I look forward to a day where the monarchy's popularity is no longer buoyed up by our toadying press and sycophantic broadcasters such as the BBC, Sky and ITV. And through demographic change, public opinion shifts and we can eventually abolish the monarchy altogether, to be replaced with a democratic and accountable head of state from outside of the royal family, outside of nobility, and perhaps indeed outside of politics, someone chosen by the people, not born into the role. The monarchy has had its time. It's a bloated, scandal-ridden institution that drains our resources and embodies the very worst of the outdated British class system of unfairness and inequality.